As Q once said to Captain Jean-Luc Picard, all good things must come to an end. And here we are. We're at the end of the road, the final edition of Kaiju Corner, my final Kaiju movie review video before getting to Godzilla King of the Monsters at the end of May. This will not be my final monster movie related video, though. I've got a few more ideas lined up before getting to Godzilla King of the Monsters release, and I might do something for Godzilla and Kong next year. Who knows? If I'm still making videos next year, who knows? Not that I'm planning on retiring anytime soon, but I've got like a little idea of what I might want to do with that, but we'll see. But for right now, we're at the end. It's over. I've done all the Toho classics. I've done Harryhausen movies. I've done Monsters All Across the World. I've done Ultraman. I've done Gamera. I've done Daimajin, Young Gary, Gappa, Jurassic Park, Pacific Rim, Cloverfield. I've covered most of the big ones. Obviously, you can't get through absolutely everything, and I didn't want to try and be comprehensive, but I got through a lot of the heavy hitters. But what better way to close out a giant monster movie review series than to talk about the granddaddy of them all, King Kong, the one that really got the ball rolling on making the idea of a giant monster attacking a city super fucking cool. King Kong, the cinematic classic, wasn't the first of its kind necessarily. It wasn't the first one to use stop motion special effects. It wasn't the first one to feature a giant monster in I guess you would call it a lead role, but it was the first one that made a major splash and was well received and became a cultural icon. And King Kong is one of the most important movies ever made. Godzilla will always be my favorite, but without King Kong, there's no Godzilla. Without King Kong, there's no Harryhausen, no Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, no Clash of the Titans, no Jason and the Argonauts, none of that. No Mothra, no Rodan, no War of the Gargantuas, none of that. I would even go as far to say without King Kong, you probably wouldn't have Star Wars, you probably wouldn't have Jurassic Park, you probably wouldn't have this monsterverse that we're getting now in the modern age. King Kong was really the one that started it all. Again, it wasn't the first, but it was the one that made the idea acceptable for general audiences and was the first one that really made a major splash. And I'm here to honor that character and to talk about the movies featuring that character and talk about just how important King Kong is. Because before Godzilla came around, 4-year-old me, when I saw King Kong vs. Godzilla the first time, my first Godzilla movie, that was the movie that made me a Godzilla fan, and I was kind of a little traitor that switched camps. But initially, I was a King Kong guy, and I remember watching the original King Kong when I was a small child, and I just fell in love with it. It's just opened my imagination to just a whole new world of fun and adventure and giant monsters tearing shit up. And it was from that day, again, Godzilla was the one that kind of maintained my fandom of giant monsters, but King Kong was the one that started it. And I will always be appreciative of the great ape, the eighth wonder of the world. Yeah, he's a legend. King Kong is an absolute legend. I just, nothing but love and respect for that character. Now, for the movies I'm going to be reviewing, I should note that there are some that are going to be left off. Some notable exemptions, the most significant of which are Skull Island. And the reason I'm not reviewing Skull Island, because I already did. There is a video of me talking about Skull Island. I will post a link in the description in case you've never seen it, but no reason for me to review it again because I've already done it. Also left off of this video are, last video I talked about monster-based TV shows. Two that will be left off are the King Kong animated shows. There was one by Rankin Bass, and there was one at the turn of the century, Kong the Animated Series. And the reason I'm not reviewing those is because I've never seen them. I watched about 5 minutes of Kong the Animated Series while I was out to lunch one day many moons ago, and I didn't really get an impression of it one way or the other. Maybe one of these days I'll check it out, but until now I've never seen it. And the Rankin Bass show, I've never seen that either. I've seen a couple clips on YouTube and everything, but I've never actually watched it. Now, one of the movies I am going to be talking about is one that was loosely based off the Rankin Bass cartoon. But yeah, it's kind of cool that King Kong has 2 animated shows. It's just a shame I've never seen them. And in doing the prep for this video series, I had a lot of movies to watch for the first time and rewatch, and there just wasn't enough time to dedicate to the King Kong shows. Honestly, Ultraman, which I'd never seen before, that show took precedence, and I felt like that was the more important one to watch. And so the Kong TV shows kind of got the shaft in that regard. But not the end of the world. I've got most of the Kong movies. And even one movie in particular that technically isn't a King Kong movie, but one that I feel is a spiritual sequel to the original Kong, and I do want to talk about that as well. So with that said, let's get started. And what better way to start than with the original, the cinematic masterpiece that is the original King Kong, 1933. And this film features, obviously, the special effects of Willis O'Brien, the stop motion that was so innovative and so revolutionary for its time, that there weren't a lot of knockoffs after the release of King Kong. It took a couple decades for people to kind of figure out the techniques of the stop motion animation, which led to Ray Harryhausen and him becoming the king of it, basically. But there weren't a lot of King Kong imitators for a long time. You would think that came out and there would just be an endless supply of attempts to try and capitalize on the success of King Kong, but it didn't really happen right away. So Kong stayed king for quite a while, and even, I talk about Godzilla and Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Those didn't come out until the mid-50s. So over 2 decades after this movie had been released. So it took a long time for people to catch up on how to do the stop-motion special effects. And I think that long period of dominance for King Kong allowed him to not only become a cultural icon, but maintain that position for a long time. And there's a certain magic and wonder to that film that's perfectly emblematic of that era of filmmaking, where there's a lot of discovery. And that's one of the reasons I love that era of Hollywood. There's just a lot of trial and error and creativity, and just doing your best with the little that you have. It's one of the reasons I love the Universal film, the Universal monster movies so much, the Draculas, the Frankensteins, and all those. They're so minimalistic, but that was all they had back then, and they did some great stuff with it. And it's got a style and a universe all of its own. The Wizard of Oz, great example. Fantasy films like that were just non-existent prior to Wizard of Oz, and that was a huge trendsetter. And King Kong is just one of those movies where it really gave birth to kind of the action-packed, I guess what we would call today the equivalent of a summer blockbuster. I actually just watched Avengers Endgame yesterday before filming this video, and it makes me wonder. It's like, would we have even the Avengers and even things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe if it wasn't for King Kong? Because it really just tapped into that. Especially going back and rewatching the movie, it's not the most dynamic story in the world. It's got great themes, but I don't think anybody would call these characters like the deepest characters in the world. You've got Denham, who is motivated entirely by sensationalism and greed, and he basically plucks King Kong out of his world and sticks him right smack dab in the middle of New York City, and chaos ensues. Ann Darrow, famously played by Fay Wray, I think you would consider her kind of like almost like an old style, almost anachronistic leading lady, where she's just there to scream at the monster, and not much else beyond that. But what this movie offered that was, I guess, unheard of at the time was this action-packed spectacle. And this is where I think Jurassic Park pulls a lot of its influence from King Kong, where just the majesty of these creatures and seeing them on the screen and fighting with each other and attacking people and all this other stuff, it really does capture a certain level of imagination that really impacts children. Like, Jurassic Park is definitely one of those movies that, as a kid, it's like the best movie you've ever seen, because it's just incredible. And it's still a very good movie. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying, when you see those type of movies when you're young, they really have a huge impact on you. Godzilla was one of those for me, and King Kong was one of those for me. And I think King Kong was that way for a lot of people. I think Kong, there's just something so iconic about the name, the creature, the set pieces, the fights with all the dinosaurs, which are great, and the animation style, which again is dated by today's standards, but back then, we're talking almost 80 years, and for them to do what they did and basically invent a new way of making special effects, it just looks incredible to me. And very much like the Harryhausen films, where it's like, wow, this is the amount of work that went into creating these effects is just mind-blowing to me. And it does have this very old-school, homemade, wonderful charm to it. And I've mentioned it, and I hate to keep comparing it to Godzilla, but Godzilla, the original one, is a movie that really needed to be in black and white. You would be taking something away from the film if it was in color. King Kong is a movie that's like, man, that would have looked awesome in color, right? Like, the different creatures and dinosaurs and how colorful they would have been and everything. Man, it would have looked great. So you really do feel like when you go to the island and you meet Kong and all these dinosaurs, and you're kind of, again, it's kind of like a Wizard of Oz thing where you feel like you're just transported to a whole new world, and it's just nothing but excitement, danger, and imagination. And it's a fascinating film to watch, and one that I can revisit almost every day. And actually, my DVD of it has a special commentary from Ray Harryhausen, who was obviously very heavily inspired by this film, and that really just speaks to the historical impact that this movie really had. And for my money, I mean, him on the Empire State Building holding Fay Wray while planes are shooting at him, for me, it's one of the all-time great movie climaxes and a huge trendsetter. And when I visited New York a few years ago, I made sure to go to the Empire State Building, and they, of course, had a lot of King Kong merchandise up there on the top floor. And the view from up there is amazing, by the way. If you've ever been to New York, like, the view from the Empire State Building is incredible. And here we are again, 80 years after this movie came out, and it still has a cultural impact. It still feels relevant, and it's still fresh on people's minds. It's just the image of King Kong on the Empire State Building getting shot down, and the tragedy of this creature being plucked out of his home, where he's king, and put into an environment that he's not familiar with, doesn't belong in, and just chaos ensues. And he dies because he's infatuated with this woman. 'Twas beauty killed the beast, and unfairly made the victim of other people's crimes, namely Denim, who is the true villain of that film. The smart-ass little weasel. But, I think the original King Kong is, if you're a fan of movies, I think it's must-see. I think, most people, think of your favorite blockbuster or your favorite creature feature or your favorite monster movie. There's a real good chance that King Kong inspired that movie in some way, shape, or form. And it's, like I said, it's the granddaddy of them all. The original Kong, I think, is a masterpiece. I think it's one of the best films of that era. There are a few films from around that time period, that era of Hollywood, that I would put up on the same pedestal. I personally, and this is me being a giant monster movie fan, I would put it above The Wizard of Oz. And I know that's sacrilege to some people, but it's King Kong, man. Come on, he's great. And as it turns out, King Kong is a perfectly sympathetic character. Even though he's this ape that's running around breaking shit up, it's look, he didn't ask for this, and he doesn't understand everything that's going on. And, a beautiful woman comes along, and he gets infatuated, and trouble happens. So, a lot of great themes, great action set pieces, a tragic rise and fall of the character of King Kong, and movie magic. Movie history was made with the release of that film. But that would not be the end for King Kong. We would get a sequel very similarly to, again, another comparison to Godzilla, very similarly to how Godzilla Raids Again was kind of rushed into production after the success of the original film. Shortly after the success of the original Kong, we got a sequel that almost nobody remembers, Son of Kong, where Denim, facing troubles after being blamed for the destruction caused by King Kong. He was hit with all the lawsuits, and everybody blamed him for it and everything. And it's yeah, it's your fault, pal. I mean, you're the one that brought a giant ape in chains and put him on stage in Broadway, which is, again, an amazing scene and everything. But it's, it's all Denim's fault. And that's exactly where you should be after the events of the first Kong movie. But the movie kind of settles down where he goes back to the island, and it becomes kind of a treasure hunt, and he meets up with a young Kong, the son of Kong. And the son of Kong takes a liking to him, and it's kind of like this, it's kind of a fun romp of a film, and you get the special effects that still look really good. The Son of Kong is very expressive, and you get a few scenes of a few more dinosaurs and everything like that. But it never quite reaches the level of the original Kong, and I think reducing it to a treasure hunt kind of lowers the stakes a little bit and doesn't quite make the same impact of, the tragedy of King Kong getting knocked off the Empire State Building. Doesn't quite have the same impact to it, but if I were going to compare it to anything, I think I would compare it to Dracula's Daughter, which was the sequel to the Universal Dracula film with Bela Lugosi, and that's one that often gets forgotten. And the reason it gets forgotten is because it doesn't feature any of the big-name stars. No Karloff, no Lugosi, no Lon Chaney, none of those guys are in it. So I think people kind of forget that it ever happened. But I think Gloria Holden's performance as the titular Dracula's Daughter is really, really underrated. And there's a lot of good stuff in there, even if it's not quite as good as the original, or it's not quite as good as some of the other better ones in the Universal canon. There is something there, and I think it's kind of this neat little gem. So if you go and check it out, I think you'll have fun. And that's kind of how I feel about this film. It's not required viewing necessarily, but it is this rare hidden gem, which kind of makes me want to watch it. I mean, when because I didn't know Son of Kong existed when I was younger. I didn't even know about it until I was a teenager. I was like, there was a sequel to the original King Kong? I want to see that, and of course I did. And so I think the rarity of it and the fact that not a lot of people know about it kind of makes it fun to watch. Again, it's nowhere near as classic as the original Kong. I do like that Denham was back, and he kind of gets to be the leading man in this one, but it's nowhere near as good or as classic as the original film, and probably the first case of a sequel failing to live up to the original in cinema history, but it's fun viewing for what it is. So if you accept it for what it is, you'll probably enjoy it just fine, but it's not required viewing at all. Next up is a movie that does not feature King Kong, but one that I feel, as I mentioned earlier, it is a spiritual sequel to King Kong, and that is the Warner Brothers classic Mighty Joe Young, which got a remake in the 90s, which I've never seen. It's one of those movies I'm like, why are you remaking Mighty Joe Young? I don't care, but I've never seen the remake, so I don't know. But in this movie, we get to see Willis O'Brien's special effects put to good use with another giant ape, Mighty Joe Young, who is friends with this woman who's running a reserve off in Africa, I believe. And the ape catches the attention of somebody, and they want to make a show out of him and help her make money and everything. And so he becomes a bit of a celebrity, but then things go wrong because humans mistreat him. So he ends up locked in a cage, and then he breaks out, and then everybody's chasing him. But then he saves a bunch of orphans from a fire in this really dynamic scene. And it's like, oh, Mighty Joe Young has a heart. Unfortunately, he doesn't get killed at the end, so there's that. Spoiler alert, but sorry. But, God, I'm as bad at spoiling things as Mark Ruffalo. But anyway, Mighty Joe Young featured Willis O'Brien's special effects, but with Ray Harryhausen working underneath him. And so this movie kind of represents a passing of the torch where Ray Harryhausen would ultimately become the king of the stop-motion animation. And to be honest, I mean, looking at the animation and the moments in this film, like the tug-of-war scene where Mighty Joe Young is pulling all the strongmen in the tug-of-war, and the reveal of Mighty Joe Young on stage for his first performance, I guess you would call it, where his handler is playing Little Dreamer on piano, and the curtains pull back and you see Mighty Joe Young holding up a platform that's holding her and the piano while she's playing it. Amazing scene, an amazing visual. It's one of my favorite scenes in cinema history, to be perfectly honest, because it's such a well-crafted and a beautiful reveal of the character and a way to show off the special effect as well. And like I said, you get all these really dynamic scenes where you really do feel sympathetic towards Joe. And very much, again, like a spiritual sequel to King Kong. And, he's... the special effects themselves, I think, are an advancement, kind of like the next step in the process from King Kong. It's like, okay, we've seen these dynamic action sequences where King Kong is battling a dinosaur, and we kind of superimpose the actors in front of it and make it look like they're actually watching it. What if we actually have the stop motion effect in the same shot as the human actors, and see if we can do that? And make that work, which is where you get scenes like the tug-of-war scene and various things like that. And all of it is very well done, very good for its time. And I think that this movie is a worthy successor to King Kong. And like I said, it represents a passing of the torch from Willis O'Brien to Ray Harryhausen, who would become the king of the stop motion special effects. So that is that's pretty much my thoughts on Mighty Joe Young. I think it's great. I personally, I think it's maybe it gets underrated. I think maybe some people kind of look at it as a King Kong knockoff, which I guess I could see where that comes from, but I see it as more of like a spiritual homage to the original Kong rather than a straight up ripoff. And of all the Kong ripoffs that are out there, and there are plenty of them, I think Mighty Joe Young is about as good as it gets. So that one gets a huge stamp of approval from me. I think Mighty Joe Young is great. And again, it gave us the start of Ray Harryhausen and his wonderful work and his contributions to cinema. So Mighty Joe Young is one that I highly recommend. Now we take King Kong into the 60s, and there were a couple of King Kong movies in the 60s, and they were made by Toho. Now, I'm not going to review King Kong vs. Godzilla again. I've already reviewed it as part of my Godzilla movie review series, so no reason to, retread over those grounds. But there was another Toho King Kong movie, and there was actually plans for King Kong to fight Ibira. Ultimately, Kong got pulled from that film, and that film ultimately got turned into Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. And if you watch that movie, it's kind of obvious that it was supposed to be King Kong in that role and not Godzilla. It kind of shows. But the movie I'm going to be talking about today is King Kong Escapes, which is loosely based on the Rankin Bass animated show that I talked about earlier. At least that's what I've been told. And here it's I don't know, it's a little weird. It's almost like a Bond movie almost, in a way where you have like this super villain called Doctor Who. Not the Doctor Who you're thinking of. He's just named Doctor Who. And he wants to use King Kong to mine radiation for him. And so he has to like find a way to like capture Kong and trick him and basically make King Kong into a slave. And then King Kong breaks out and causes havoc and blah, blah, blah. So that's where the title King Kong Escapes come from. And so you have that element. You have like a femme fatale type of character who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was an actress in a Bond movie. I'll have to look that up later. I should probably know it now in preparation for the video, right? But yeah, so you've got some like weird Bond movie elements seeping into this film, and you have like the straight-laced action hero. You have the leading lady who does nothing but scream, and is actually super annoying if you go back and watch the film. The way she says King Kong's name over and over and over again, you'll just want to punch her right in her face. She's just very annoying and not the best actress in the world, but there are a couple of neat things here. The Kong suit looks better than it did in King Kong vs. Godzilla, but that's not saying much. Still doesn't look great. But we do get to see King Kong fight a special creature to my heart, and that would be Gorosaurus. This is Gorosaurus' film debut. And Gorosaurus is one of those Toho monsters that doesn't get a lot of love, but I've always had like a huge soft spot for. He got a couple of highlight moments in Destroy All Monsters, and hasn't appeared since. But I always hold out hope that one day I will see him in another film. But the reason I bring him up is that he fights King Kong one-on-one and is ultimately defeated in a way that references the original film. How King Kong defeated the Tyrannosaurus Rex in that film mirrors the Gorosaurus King Kong fight in this film. So it's kind of like interesting that you get like the stop motion version of the fight scene, and then in this movie you get like the suitmation version of the fight scene, and then when I get to the Peter Jackson version, you get like the CGI version of the fight scene. So it's very interesting that fight has been redone so many times with all these different styles of special effects. So that's actually kind of neat. You can almost track like King Kong's evolution through his fights with Tyrannosaurus-like monsters. But anyway, so he fights with Gorosaurus, and the real reason I'm bringing it up is that Gorosaurus has a unique distinction in that he is the only monster in history to share the screen with both Godzilla and King Kong. Gorosaurus, he didn't do much. They don't use him much, but he had his day in the sun, and he's got that little nugget under his belt. So that's really, really friggin' cool. We also see King Kong do battle with a robot version of himself created by Doctor Who that has like flashlight eyes to blind him, and a little grenade belt that he can throw grenades with, and it's so kooky and weird that it's great. And It's amazing because Mechagodzilla is the famous robot clone, but this actually predates Mechagodzilla. So it's actually interesting that Kong did it first. It makes me wonder, for the MonsterVerse next year, Godzilla versus Kong, I imagine, and this is just me speculating, I imagine it's going to play out very similarly to Batman versus Superman, where they're going to fight, but then they're going to team up at the end. It's like, what if they team up against Mechagodzilla and Mechanic-Kong? I wouldn't be opposed to that. I was like, all right, we're down the rabbit hole now. This is going to be insane. Let's just do it. But anyway, King Kong escapes. My overall impressions, it's got some kooky, weird moments in it, like Gorosaurus and Mechanic-Kong, and that stuff is fun, but the human element is really weird and off-putting and kind of annoying. Like I said, the leading lady in particular is really obnoxious, so there's not a whole lot going on. Again, it's another one of those movies. You don't really need to see it. The only reason I would recommend it is to see Gorosaurus and Mechanic-Kong. That's really it. Anything else is just kind of this cheesy schlock that's not even that fun at being cheesy schlock for the most part. But again, Robot Kong, kind of neat. Gorosaurus, kind of neat. So you have those things in there. But overall, not not too great of a film. And unfortunately, Toho just could not get King Kong quite right. It's really weird. Like, when you look at the suit in King Kong versus Godzilla, then you see how this film turned out. It's like, man, War of the Gargantuas was so great, so you would think that they'd be able to do Kong really well, and it just didn't happen. And it's like, man, that's a shame. But hopefully the Monster versus Godzilla versus Kong will help redeem that, and we get like the definitive Kong versus Godzilla battle. So fingers crossed, here's hoping. But from there, we get our first remake of King Kong, the 1970s version. And this one was a movie I hated when I was younger. It had a bit of a bad reputation. Everybody kind of shit on it. And I didn't like it the first time I saw it. It stars Jessica Lange and Jeff Bridges in the lead roles. And it changes a lot. So it's not just a straight remake. It is a remake, but it's not like a Psycho remake where it's basically just the same exact movie. They're not looking to make a movie. They're looking to drill for oil. So that's why they go to the island. And they come across King Kong. And there's various other little changes here and there. He doesn't get knocked off the Empire State Building. He gets knocked off the World Trade Center, which now you know why you probably don't see that movie on TV very much anymore. But the movie was one that I hated when I was younger. On the rewatch, in preparation for this series, I actually found myself liking it a lot more. Still not great. I still prefer the original, but where this one really shined for me, I think Kong himself looks really good. And I kind of liked the actors for the most part, and I liked the climax and how that was handled. And this was the first one where the leading lady in Kong kind of, because again, in Fay Ray, she just kind of screamed the whole time, but here there was a little bit more of a bond between Jessica Lange and King Kong, and I think that maybe added to the tragedy a little bit, and made for a different spin on the climax, aside from just setting it at the World Trade Center. And overall, I thought was a fairly solid and respectful remake, and I'm not entirely sure why it has such a bad reputation. I don't even know why I hated it the first time. Maybe it was just me back then. I was like, oh, it's a remake. But I gave it a second chance here, and I'm glad I did. I was actually like, all right, it's not great. It's not entirely necessary, especially if you've seen the original film, but as like a reintroduction for Kong into a new decade and with new special effects and in color, it's pretty solid. Like, it does its job admirably. Now, it also got a sequel, which I really want to talk about this one because this one is hilarious. King Kong Lives. So, as we all know, King Kong dies at the end of almost all of his movies because that's how the game is played. But this Kong was kept alive on life support with an artificial heart by scientists. So we're in basically full Frankenstein mode here with King Kong. And they find a mate, Lady Kong, that they're able to do a blood transfusion with. And so King Kong is revived, gets attached to this new mate, and then goes crazy and runs off with scientists and the military off pursuing him because they want to keep him for scientific research and everything. And so really it's about King Kong and his mate staying safe. And you've got Linda Hamilton in this film. It's so weird. Like, she's famous for Terminator, obviously, but I feel like I'm always catching her in these really oddball films. And here she is in this wacky, like, crazy science fiction King Kong sequel. And I also remember the first time I saw Children of the Corn, I'm like, is that Sarah Connor? Is Children of the Corn? And that's a really weird movie, but to be in. Kind of fun, though, for what it is. But for King Kong Lives, this movie gets batshit crazy. And total schlock, especially when you watch the end. And some of the cheesiness with Kong and his mate, and they have a kid too. Isn't that great? King Kong has a son, and but where this movie really shines is that it is so unabashedly stupid that it is really entertaining for how stupid it is. And especially the fight at the end with Kong just beating up the military is just a wild hoot. So I'm not going to say it's a good movie, but I will say it's a fun movie. I'm going to recommend it. So you will not be bored, I don't think. Just throwing that out there. But King Kong Lives, the sequel I thought was, not the sequel, but the remake, the first movie with Jessica Lange, I thought was pretty solid and well made. This one is just total schlock that nowadays, if this were to come out, it would probably be straight to video or straight to streaming or something like that. But for what it is a hoot to watch. You will not be bored. I can say that. And, yeah, that's King Kong Lives. Probably, in a weird way, probably the worst Kong movie ever made, but also the best in its own, like, weird, like, warped way. It's the best so bad it's good Kong movie. I'll throw that out there. So finally, the one I want to talk about last here is the Peter Jackson remake. The movie that is so long, I might still be in the theater watching it. I'm not sure. But this is Peter Jackson's take on King Kong. It's basically just a straight modern-day remake of the original film that is ungodly long, as everyone has pointed out. It's over 3 hours long because after Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson just can't make a movie that's under 3 hours. And, I've never seen the extended cut of the film, and I was like, when I heard that there was an extended cut, I'm like, what the fuck did you cut from this movie, dude? And that's really the major problem that a lot of people have with this movie. It is just too goddamn long. And it's King Kong, for God's sake. It does not need to be 3 hours long. It's not the works of Tolkien that you're working with here. So parts of it go really, really long, and that's definitely a problem. However, I like this movie more than most do. I think it's a pretty solid remake. And where it really shines for me, I think the actors, for the most part, are really good. Adrian Brody as the lead is pretty solid. Jack Black as Denham, I thought was really, really good. I was worried he was going to be a little out of place in there, but he's actually pretty good. And the actor I want to praise the most from this film is actually Naomi Watts. I thought she did an amazing job in this, and to me, she's kind of become like the definitive Ann Darrows. I've always liked Naomi Watts as an actress, and I thought she really shined here. And her bond with Kong here added a lot of heart to the film and made the character of Ann Darrow, I think, a little bit more interesting than, say, the original film. Now, there are scenes that really don't work, like the scene of them ice skating, I think, is a little silly, and maybe they humanized Kong a little too much, but overall, I thought her performance kind of carries the film, generally. And the action scenes of Kong look amazing, even in CGI, which I'm not the biggest fan of CGI, but again, it's really interesting to see kind of the evolution of special effects through King Kong, and I think this is like a necessary step almost, where we get to see, like, this is the definitive CGI Kong, although Skull Island was pretty good too. But I think that, again, there's a lot of stuff you could have cut from this film, but I think Peter Jackson's enthusiasm and his respect for the original film shines through. I think he wanted to create I don't think he tried to top the original film. I think he wanted to do like a respectful companion piece to the original film, kind of build off of it and make his own take. And again, it was too long. There's scenes that don't need to be there, but the stuff that works, I think, really, really works. And I think a lot of it is carried through some really well-crafted action sequences, some great direction from Peter Jackson, even with a little too much slow-mo, but great direction for the most part, and some really strong performances from the actors, namely Naomi Watts. So I think the Jackson remake is a respectful remake and a good one, and worth checking out. But again, if you watch it, you're going to be there for a while. So either get the fast forward button ready, or grab a beer and pop a squat because you're not going anywhere. But, yeah, so that concludes all the King Kong movies I was going to review. So, excuse me. That concludes Kaiju Corner. I'm done. I've gotten through all the giant monster movie reviews that I wanted to watch and review, and thank you all so much for joining me on this journey and watching all of these movies and reviewing all of these movies and getting the series done. This is something that was requested a few times back in the past, especially when I did the Godzilla movie review series. Some people requested, are you going to review other giant monster movies? I'm like, well, I don't really know, and it's something that I toyed around with for a really, really long time, and until finally, I think Godzilla King of the Monsters, and there was a really long wait for that film. 5 years between that and the 2014 Godzilla. So when this movie finally looked like it's like, all right, it's gonna happen, and it's kind of getting close. It's like, all right, I can use like these monster movie reviews as a way to kind of build into the anticipation for that movie. So everything kind of worked out the way it was supposed to, and I talked about all the movies that I wanted to talk about, and it was really delightful to go back and relive some of those memories and go back and watch some of those movies and pay honor to the movie characters, the monsters that I love so much. The Rodans, the Gamoras, the Mothras, the Gargantuas, the King Kongs, the dinosaurs, the wonderful creations of Ray Harryhausen, and so many more. I could just go on and on and on, and I've even discovered some new favorites. Like, I had never seen the Daimajin movies prior to these reviews. I'd never seen Ultraman prior to these reviews. Glad I did. I'm glad I watched them, and I guess you could consider me a fan of those things now. And I was really happy to do the series. It was very fulfilling for me, and hopefully you all enjoyed it as well. Now, like I said, this is not going to be the end of my monster talk. Obviously, we've got Godzilla King of the Monsters coming out. I've got a few more video ideas throughout the month of May to kind of further build anticipation for that film. And obviously, I have to review the movie, right? I've got to do it. I'll probably film something right after I get out of the theater. Who knows? Could be fun. Could be fun. I hope the movie's living up to its extreme potential. But that is all I have for you now. Again, thank you all for watching, and thank you for joining me on this journey and enjoying these monster movies right along with me. But that is all I have for you now, so peace out. I'll see you later.